Hello and welcome to Freedom First. This is Jeffrey Tucker. Today I would like to talk about the strength of the economy. You know the line, everybody says it. Oh, the economy is doing so well. Everything is so strong and beautiful and wonderful. Jobs everywhere, inflation down, productivity is up, stock markets are performing beautifully. And yet there's a strange aspect to this. The press tells us the American people are unhappy. We're so ungrateful. We're crabby and down in the mouth and pessimistic and just waiting for the next calamity to come. And they say, I've read 100 stories to this effect at this point, they're every day in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and so on, that we are irrational. We're not looking at the facts. Look at the facts. Look at all the data. It's proof the economy is good. Now, this is very strange. What these stories are saying is that you and I are stupid people. We don't understand what the economists understand. They get, because they read the data and understand the underlying statistical realities, that everything's wonderful. Whereas you, on the other hand, are crabby about your prices, feel like your income is going down, none of which is true. Now, this has been very upsetting to me because I don't tend to just intuitively believe this. I mean, if you don't believe you're doing as well off now as you were, say, 5 years ago, there's a chance that you're probably right about it. I mean, all the data thrown at you is not going to make a difference, really, if you don't feel as rich as you used to be. So I thought maybe I would examine some of these things and show you a little bit about how the statistics are used to manipulate you and convince you to believe things that are simply not true. There are three things that are always cited as proof that the economy is doing well. One is the unemployment rate, the other is the inflation rate, and the third thing is the GDP, which measures output. Unemployment is low, inflation is down, GDP is up. What are you complaining about? Well, I'm here to tell you, and I've been looking at this data for decades, really. I have never seen so much statistical manipulation in my life as I see every single month when these agencies are distributing this data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Department of Labor and so on. It's all just very, very sketchy, and every month it seems to get worse. This is particularly true with the Biden administration. I don't know what's going on. In the old days, these economic bureaus that would distribute this data were considered to be independent scientists and outside of political manipulation and control. That doesn't seem to be true anymore. It seems as if there's something going on here where the Biden administration is, I don't have proof of this, but it seems as if the Biden administration is manipulating the press releases that are attached to these data. But still, if you follow it closely, you can find the breadcrumbs and find out very quickly that none of the things they're claiming are true. So let's take on each of these things one at a time. The first one is the unemployment rate. So we hear this 3.7%, and we should be very happy that's historically low. Full employment back in the 1930s and 40s was considered 6%. We're at 3.7. We have no reason to complain about it. Well, if you look more carefully at the data, you find out otherwise. One is that the labor participation rate has never recovered from the lockdowns of March 2020 and following. We're at really low labor participation rates. Many people had their businesses shut and were locked out of their offices or otherwise displaced professionally by vaccine mandates or whatever. And they just decided to retire early, or maybe they're demoralized, or something has happened to cause the American labor force to shrink dramatically insofar as it affects people's willingness to go to work. So under the unemployment data, if you have fewer people actually applying for jobs, and everybody who's applying for a job gets a job of some sort, that is going to drive down the unemployment rate. But if you include all the people that are not in the workforce, that used to be in the workforce, the unemployment rate is actually higher than the low levels of full employment. It's 6 or even as high as 7% or even higher. So this 3.7 piece of data is just completely illusory. It doesn't tell you anything about whether people are engaged in work. Maybe they're disabled, maybe they're demoralized, maybe they're just living with their mom, watching videos in the basement all day. There's a million reasons why people are not working, but the point is the workforce has shrunk, and a lot of people who left the workforce never went back to work. So yes, of course, you can call it low unemployment, but it doesn't actually mean anything about the health of an economy. So that's the first point. We really need to retire this old-fashioned official unemployment rate because it doesn't mean what people think it means. Another factor here, and we've talked about this before, fewer and fewer people are even responding to the surveys of government agencies when they call or write businesses and ask them how many employees they have. This profoundly affects what's called the establishment survey. When a government writes businesses and asks them how many people are working there. Fewer and fewer businesses are even responding. And when they do respond, there's a problem because they say, oh, we have 30 workers, we have 40 workers, we have 50 workers, we've hired new people. Chances are those people are part-time, and those are being double counted by other businesses that are saying the same thing. So it turns out multiple job holders is at historic highs right now. Many of the new jobs being created are part-time jobs, and the establishment survey of unemployment are engaged in double counting. Now you'll notice that when they report these jobs figures, that's what they always report. 350,000 new jobs and so on. They're always looking at that survey rather than the other survey, which is far more accurate, which is the household survey. They survey a certain number of households and extrapolate that based on a normal distribution of the whole population. Here, you see, in the most recent figures, a net decline in the number of jobs. So for example, if you're holding 3 jobs right now, and the agency calls you up and says, are you working? You say, yes. You're not going to count it 3 times because you have 3 jobs. No, you're just going to count it once. So through this method, you can get a far more accurate reading, but that is never in the press releases of the Bureau of Labor Statistics when they send this out. Nor does it appear on the front page of the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. And then the Wall Street sees, oh, lots of jobs being created, and it's buy, and the stock market goes up. It's all just kind of crazy and doesn't actually make any sense. It's just not even true. I have friends of mine that are very much closer watch of this data at the Heritage Foundation tell me there have been no new full-time jobs created. We've seen losses in full-time jobs, and all the job creation, so-called, has been in part-time jobs. And that's certainly been my sense for about a year now, that most of the new job creation is the conversion of full-time jobs to part-time jobs. And so actually, a close look at the jobs data shows a disaster taking place. I mean, it's just simply unbelievable that this is called job creation, and people like Janet Yellen can go on national television touting this. It's so preposterous. As far as Wall Street's concerned, traders on Wall Street are less concerned about what's true, but rather what they believe, other people believe about what's true. Yeah, right? So it's like this sort of cycle. I know it's false, but you think it's true, and you think it's true because somebody else thinks it's true. And so the lie tends to be the basis of people's formation of expectations of the future rather than the underlying truth. At some point that could change, by the way. But we're not improving. The job situation is not improving. It's actually getting dramatically worse. Okay, that covers jobs. Let's talk for a moment about the inflation data. Now, this is a very interesting one because until a few years ago, nobody had, for the previous 40 years, really worried about inflation that much. Prices were more or less stable. So they would settle at 1 or 2%, maybe 3% per year. It's probably higher than it was being officially reported, but it wasn't a problem that vexed us constantly. We knew our purchasing power was declining, but it wasn't happening so fast to become a major issue. But after the COVID lockdowns, the Federal Reserve got busy, in effect, printing money. What happened was that Congress allocated trillions and trillions of spending. The Treasury Department notices it's not in the bank, and so creates debt instruments which go on the market, which the Fed buys with newly created money. As a result, M2 soared. It peaked at 26% increases per annum. It was unbelievable. And depending on how you calculate it, there were between $5 and $8 trillion created by the Federal Reserve during this period. Now, this is the same period in which the government was sending out stimulus checks to businesses and homes. It's a very strange time to be alive, actually, because most of the time you feel like you're paying government money. Suddenly you woke up, you didn't have to go to work, you're lounging around in your pajamas, and instead of paying the government's paying you. You should have known something was going wrong at that point. Well, sure enough, a year later, the bill came due in the form of very high inflation, which got higher and higher and higher. And they said it was transitory. That didn't happen. This began in 2021. Here we are in 2024. We're still dealing with very high inflation by every reading. It's so annoying. Every month, the data comes in, and it still looks terrible. You look at the sticky price index, which excludes food and energy, which are more volatile, it's still very high by any standard. And yet, the Biden administration continues to claim that they've conquered inflation. Prices are under control. Inflation's basically gone. And yet, the data never seems to cooperate. Now, looking at this, what's happened since 2020 to prices? According to the CPI, the dollar has lost about 20% of its value. So the dollar of 2020 is now worth 80 cents in 2024. That's what the official data says. I don't know anybody who believes that. Based on your shopping alone, does it feel like only 20 cents of the dollar are gone? Or does it feel a little more like 30% or 50% or even 80% or 100% or more, depending on what you're shopping for? I would say it's much higher. So we began to look at this, and it all comes down to the formula that they use to assess the strength of various items within the Consumer Price Index, which measures basically everything. It doesn't account for shrinkflation, right? Everything has shrunk, from the peanut packages to laundry detergent, everything to the bag of chips, everything has shrunk. CPI typically doesn't account for shrinkflation. That's a way that businesses can get away with increasing the price while in effect increasing the price while not actually increasing the price, just giving you less product. And God, I don't blame businesses, and they're just trying to survive, and their bottom line, they're doing what they can, but shrinkflation is a major factor in everything these days. I mean, just look at it. Your toothpaste is smaller, your shampoo is smaller, everything is much smaller. It's like this magically shrinking physical world all around us. And yet still we have inflation, but inflation is far worse once you account for shrinkflation, which the Bureau of Labor Statistics, typically the Labor Department, does not do. Because they can't. I mean, it's just not impossible to account for all the shrinkflation. It's too tricky. But there are other factors too. One of the major ones has to do with health insurance premiums, what you pay for your health insurance. Now, you know for a fact that your health insurance premiums are up 20%, 30%, 50% from what they were 5 years ago. I know you know this. And if you look carefully at what your employer is paying, if you have employer-provided health insurance, the same thing is true on the employer side too. It's vastly more expensive to buy health insurance today than it was 5 years ago. But if we look at the government data, what it claims is that between 2022 and 2023, you've seen a 37% decline in the insurance premiums, health insurance premiums. Now, how in the world were they able to calculate that? I'll tell you. In October of 2023, they changed the formula to assess how they're going to account for price changes within healthcare and applied that retroactively backwards, going back several years. So what they did was this. They decided to look at what you're paying in health insurance compared with what you're consuming in health insurance, and then use a very fancy formula to assess how the changes in the allocation of what you're paying and what you're consuming, how much of that is affected by pure inflation versus your increased consumption. Now, I know that sounds a little complicated, so I'm going to give you a simple example. Let's say you have a local Chinese food restaurant that you go to, and you notice that last month you spent $50 there. and then at the end of this month, you notice that you're suddenly spending $200 there. Now, if you had consumed the same amount of Chinese food, having gone there, say, once, that would be inflation. But if you increase your trading with the Chinese food place from once to 4 times, and suddenly you're spent $200 instead of $50, that would not be inflation. That would represent an increased consumption. So they decided to do the same thing for healthcare. Now, it's true you're paying the healthcare premiums every month, whether you consume healthcare or not. But according to the government, if you are consuming healthcare resources, that should count against what you're paying. So that's the way they did it, which is kind of amazing, right? An amazing level of statistical trickery, if you ask me. So they did this in October 2023 and then backdated it. So what happened between 2020 and 2022? Well, I'll tell you, in 2020, hardly anybody was going to the hospital or the doctors because they were mostly closed and people were scared. Now, that's ironic given that this was supposed to be a pandemic of historic proportions, the worst in 100 years, and healthcare spending and consumption dramatically declined. That's right, because the hospitals were closed, most of them stayed empty, the nurses made dancing videos, the doctors weren't at work, the patients stopped going in because they were scared of COVID or were just alarmed at the state of the world, whatever. Once the lockdowns ended, now you have a whole bunch of legacy health visits that were taking place. People were less healthy because they had less exposure, and substance abuse kicked in, all sorts of factors. People started going to the doctors again. So consumption of healthcare resources and services went dramatically up. So if you can come up with a formula to compare the healthcare premiums that were themselves rising against healthcare consumption, so that that increased consumption would blot out the increase in the prices, you could even manufacture a deflation. It's pretty brilliant, right? Pretty fancy for these fancy economists that were charged with making inflation go away. This is how they did it. And so sure enough, between 2022 and 2023, they were able to generate a 37% decline in healthcare premiums. Unbelievable, even though it's completely false. Now, you mix that in with all the other index items, you can drag down the index overall, generally, dramatically, really. And that's just one example of the kind of statistical chicanery that's been going on at the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That's how they're able to say that inflation's only been 20% or so over the last 3 years. I don't believe it's true, and I don't believe this data anymore. You know, I know, everyone knows inflation's worse than what they're saying. And it's right. You're right, they're wrong. Now let's look at the GDP. Now this measures output. This statistic comes from National Income Accounting, was first invented and toyed with in the 1930s, a period in which economists and governments believed there is such a thing as national output that could be statistically calculated, and they came up with a formula to do it. This is a period where fascism and big government and central planning was very important. You know, everybody believed in it. So the Soviet Union had a GDP, and China had its GDP, and the US had its GDP, and we're all competing with each other. Well, it turned out, you know, over the decades, that a lot of these things were just lies. For example, people thought that Soviet economy was growing massively between the 1930s and the 1980s. In fact, you could pick up any American economics textbook, and they would show you a graph in any 101 textbook published in the 60s, 70s, or 80s that showed that eventually Soviet GDP was going to be higher than the American GDP because they had a faster rate of growth. Well, it turned out in 1989, with the whole Soviet experiment sort of collapsed on itself, we looked at Eastern Europe and the Soviet Empire generally, including all of its neighbors, and its far-flung neighbors to the west and to the east. Everybody was desperately poor. They lacked consumer goods, they lacked healthcare, they were dying. Grocery stores had very little choice. There was evidence of poverty. Oh, well, wait a minute. We thought that for decades this economy is growing, but it wasn't growing? It was actually shrinking? That's weird. So how do they manage that? I'll tell you, it's one trick. Actually, two. The GDP counts government spending as part of national output. That's always been true. It was true in 1934 when they came up with this nonsense, and it's true today. So the more government spends, the higher the GDP goes. Now, ask yourself, is that true? Where does government get its money? It gets its money from you and me, and from charges to businesses. I mean, that's where the government gets its money. It doesn't have any money of its own. Everything government gets, it extracts from the population. If we had the correct kind of GDP, we would be subtracting how much government spends, not from the GDP, not adding to the GDP based on government spending, but nothing has changed about the way they accumulate this data. That's why the Soviet Union was said to be so wealthy, wealthier than the US, for decades when it wasn't true. And that's true in China today. That's why the Chinese GDP keeps going up and up and up, because the government keeps spending more. And I'm sorry to say, friends, this is happening in the US too. So every time the GDP is reported, it mixes in federal government spending, state spending, and local spending. Federal government giving grants to state governments giving grants to local governments, all the government spending and hiring, that's all added to GDP. Once you take that out, and much less once you subtract it, we would have been never have gotten out of the recession of the spring of 2020, I can tell you. I've said this for a while, and I think it's really true, that we went into recession as a result of lockdowns and never really recovered from them. It's continued to vex us. People keep talking about, how are we going to soft land this great recovery? Well, let me put the question to you another way. What if there never has really been a recovery at all, and that we've been in recession this whole time? I would suggest to you that that is a much more believable story than what you're hearing from the corporate news media today, which is that the economy is strong and the Federal Reserve is trying its best to soft land the economy. I don't believe it. I don't think you should either. We've got a major problem right now. Everybody's pushing and pulling on economic forces, try to get them to do this or that. The Federal Reserve is really running out of tools. Let me mention something else that I find really intriguing about this. So we keep hearing about strong economy, right? Well, why is it that the Federal Reserve is right now toying with the idea of reducing interest rates again? What are they trying to fix? If there's no problems, why would you force interest rates down again? Well, they say it's just to prevent recession in the future. Well, I don't know. If it's not fixed, if it's not broken, you don't fix it, right, Fed? Well, I can tell you, the Fed knows that it's broken, and they're concerned that we're going to go from the existing recession to a much greater depression, a dramatic depression. That's the problem. The economy right now is running on fumes and fakery, statistical fakery, and everybody knows it in Washington. But they don't want the American people to know it. That's why the Fed is toying with the idea of lowering rates. I can tell you, it's an extremely dangerous path. In the 1970s, we experienced, after we got off the gold standard, a very high inflation from 1973, 1974. And the Federal Reserve raised rates, and inflation came back down again. And the Fed congratulated itself. So going into the 1976 election, Fed plays politics, don't let them tell you otherwise, they always play politics. Going into that election, the Federal Reserve lowered rates, inspired a new rate of money creation and credit creation, which got Carter elected. And guess what happened? 3 years later, we had, by then, the worst inflation we've had really in the whole of the 20th century, even worse than what we've recently lived through. So the Fed thought it got the problem under control, manipulated interest rates to get their preferred candidate elected, and then the inflation got much worse. I'm afraid we're on the verge of repeating this exact story. You think inflation's over? Let's see what happens in 2024. If the Fed starts lowering rates in the summer and the fall to make everything very beautiful, put some more lipstick on this pig going into the November election so that Biden can get reelected, or whoever is going to replace Biden gets reelected, look out. 2025, 2026, we could see a much worse inflation than what we just lived through. You should never believe that they've got things under control. In fact, the time when you should believe that they don't have things under control is precisely when they claim that they do. So I'm sorry for all the bad news in the show today, but no matter how you look at it, the jobs data is not real, the inflation data is not real, and the GDP data is not real. And I'm highly suspicious of everything else that's coming out of the Biden administration agencies today. So always put freedom first, then we'll get sound economics, and then we'll get the truth. This is Jeffrey Tucker.